sandals slapping on cobblestone, the distant echo of a lyre played by a street musician hoping for a coin or two. The Forum, the empire's beating political heart. A ripple moving through the mass like wind across a wheat field. Heads turn, voices lower to whispers. It is the emperor, Nero himself. He walks not with soldiers in rigid formation. It is on the figure at his side. The woman beside him is stunning. Jewels from distant provinces catch the sunlight at her neck and wrists. Her hair, a cascade of carefully arranged golden brown curls, is pinned with ornaments that sparkle like captured starlight. Her gown flows like liquid light, each step a deliberate performance of grace. And what Nero did to him is whispered of even in the most guarded halls, a tale of vanity pushed beyond the bounds of morality, of grief that curdled into obsession. When he took the throne at just 16, many Romans dared to hope for a new golden age. He lowered taxes, sponsored lavish public games, and took to the stage himself in musical and theatrical performances, delighting the common people who had never seen an emperor so eager to entertain them. For a while, it seemed the boy emperor might grow into a benevolent ruler. But in Rome, where daggers can hide behind smiles, and every shadow might conceal a plot, power is never without poison. It isolates. It whispers. It feeds on paranoia. And for Nero, the cracks in his reign began to show years before the streets of the capital would murmur the name Sporus. Some say it was the loneliness of being untouchable, the only man in an empire of 60 million who could never be contradicted. Others say it was the endless court intrigues, the fear that anyone close to him might betray him for the favor of another. And still others believe it was the loss of a woman, the one person Nero claimed to love more than life, that finally broke his tether to reality. Her name was Poppaea Sabina, and her presence would change the fate of an innocent boy forever. To understand how Nero became the architect of Sporus's nightmare, we must step back to the very beginning of his reign, to the moment when Rome thought it had found not just an emperor, but a savior. It was 54 AD. The boy who would be emperor was only 16, barely past the age when Roman youths donned the toga virilis to mark manhood. He was the adopted son of the previous emperor, Claudius, and the great-great-grandson of the revered Augustus himself. His bloodline carried legitimacy. His youth promised energy and vision. Rome was weary of old men and rigid politics. A young ruler, advised by wise statesmen, seemed to herald renewal. And in those first years, Nero played his role well. He was guided by two of the sharpest minds in Rome, the philosopher Seneca, who nurtured his intellect, and the praetorian prefect Burrus, and funded spectacles for the people's enjoyment. He walked among citizens, performed on stage, even sang, actions that, though shocking to the elite, made him beloved among the lower classes. The young emperor had an artist's heart. He believed the empire could be a gallery, its citizens uplifted by beauty and art. He saw himself not only as ruler, but as creator. Every wall hides a listener. Every smile may conceal a rival's ambition. The higher one climbs, the more one feels the wind at the peak, exhilarating but cold. Slowly, the young emperor's circle tightened. The very men who had once advised him began to find themselves at odds with his growing independence. Political debates turned into veiled threats. And in the shadows, Nero began to feel that every hand stretched toward him might hold a blade. This constant pressure bred paranoia. The philosopher Seneca taught that power was best worn lightly. But power's grip on Nero was already too deep. He began to measure loyalty not in counsel, but in obedience. He tested those around him, watching for signs of hesitation, punishing the faintest hint of defiance. And into this volatile court, where fear and flattery were currency, came a woman who seemed to embody everything Nero secretly longed for: beauty, brilliance, and an ambition that matched his own. Her name would be whispered for years to come: Poppaea Sabina. Poppaea Sabina was no ordinary beauty drifting through the marble halls of Rome. She carried with her the polished manners and education of the Roman elite, but behind her poise lay a mind sharp enough to cut through the most tangled webs of court intrigue. The chroniclers of the time, even those who despised her, could not deny her presence. She was tall, fair-skinned, and her hair, a golden sheen meticulously maintained with the rarest saffron oils, was said to glow in the torchlight of evening banquets. But her allure was not merely physical. Poppaea understood the subtle arts of conversation, knowing when to flatter, when to challenge, and when to let silence work in her favor. When Nero first saw her, Poppaea was her opposite in every way. Where Octavia avoided attention, Poppaea commanded it. Where Octavia's quiet presence faded into the background of court life, Poppaea's laughter and wit made her the centerpiece of any gathering. In the rigid, mask-like society of Rome's aristocracy, she was vibrant and alive. She was also ambitious. That marriage had given her access to higher social circles, but she was not a woman to settle for proximity to power. She intended to hold it in her own hands, even if she had to wield it through someone else. When her path crossed with Nero's, the attraction was immediate. What began as a flirtation quickly became a dangerous liaison. At first, it was the usual imperial scandal: whispered meetings, exchanged gifts, stolen glances across crowded banquets. But in the privacy of his chambers, Nero found himself drawn deeper, and flattered the belief that he was destined for greatness beyond politics. For Nero, who was beginning to chafe under the constraints of advisors and political obligations, and her supporters, loyalists from the old regime, watched with quiet alarm as the young ruler's heart drifted elsewhere. For them, Poppaea represented instability. The risk of the emperor falling under the influence of someone who sought personal advancement over the stability of Rome. Those fears would soon prove prophetic, because Nero's fascination with Poppaea was not the kind that cooled with time. It was the kind that deepened into obsession, an obsession that would unravel lives, end in blood. But they might as well have been made of parchment, for every word spoken within them seemed to seep through the cracks and find its way to eager ears. Servants, freedmen, and political aides carried gossip like merchants carried wares, trading stories for influence or coin. And now, the whispers had turned toward Nero's growing attachment to Poppaea Sabina. At first, the talk was harmless. Murmurs of admiration for her beauty, amused recountings of her sharp wit. But soon the tone shifted. Those loyal to Octavia, the dutiful empress, began to speak of Poppaea as a schemer. They claimed she had lured the emperor into neglecting affairs of state, that her counsel was slowly replacing that of his most trusted advisors. In the Senate, older patricians shook their heads in disapproval. An emperor distracted is an empire in danger, one was overheard saying. Others, more pragmatic, saw opportunity. She navigated this growing web of intrigue with careful steps, ensuring that any favor she granted came at a price. To the emperor's critics, she became a convenient villain. To his flatterers, she was a potential ally. And to Nero himself, she became indispensable, not just as a lover, but as a voice that encouraged his most daring and sometimes reckless impulses. Octavia, for her part, remained silent. She had been raised in the rigid traditions of the Julio-Claudian dynasty, where dignity was armor and discretion a weapon. She did not fight openly for Nero's affection. Perhaps she believed that such a display would only humiliate her further. But her very restraint made her a symbol of stability in the eyes of the people. The common citizens, especially the women of Rome, admired her modesty and loyalty. This public affection for Octavia began to irritate Nero. He resented the unspoken comparison between her quiet grace and Poppaea's vivacious charm. Worse, Poppaea herself began to press him, subtly at first, then more directly, to dissolve his marriage. The more Nero hesitated, the more persistent she became. She spoke of the future they could share, of the legacy they could build together, if only the obstacle of Octavia were removed. Plans that would determine the fate of an empress and, in time, lead to the final descent of a young man whose life was already tangled in their web. By 62 AD, the whispers had hardened into strategy. Poppaea no longer spoke of if Octavia would be removed, but when. Nero's hesitation was not out of love for his wife. That bond had withered long ago, but out of fear. Octavia was not merely a woman. She was the daughter of Emperor Claudius, the last living link to a lineage that still commanded deep loyalty among Rome's citizens and legions. To move against her was to risk open revolt. Poppaea understood this, and so she began the quiet work of dismantling Octavia's public image. Rumors were planted, not by shouting accusers, but by soft voices in the right ears. A servant might murmur to a senator's wife about Octavia's supposed coldness. A freedman might accidentally mention that she had failed in her most sacred duty, to give the emperor an heir. The accusations grew bolder. Soon, they reached the emperor's own court, where Nero was told that his empress had been unfaithful. The name of her supposed lover, the court musician Anicetus, was whispered, a man far beneath her station, whose very association was meant to humiliate her. But the people of Rome did not believe it. When word of the charges reached the streets, they reacted with outrage. Women left offerings at the temples in Octavia's name. Crowds gathered near the palace, shouting for her release when she was placed under house arrest. Her name was a rallying point for dissent. Within weeks, the order came. She was to die. The method was as cruel as it was efficient. Accounts differ. Some say she was bound and suffocated by steam in an overheated bath, others that she was simply executed. In either case, her end was quiet, without trial, without defense. She was only 23 years old. Her death sent a ripple of unease through Rome. It was not the first time an empress had been cast aside. The halls echoed with celebration. Poppaea was now empress. Nero believed he had removed the final obstacle to his happiness. But history has a way of turning victories into seeds of ruin. The next act would prove that Octavia's death was not the end of Nero's descent. It was the beginning of a spiral that would consume everyone close to him, including Poppaea herself, by 65 AD. But victory brought no peace. Poppaea, now the most powerful woman in Rome, was still Poppaea, ambitious, proud, and unafraid to press her will upon the emperor. At first, Nero adored her for it. She guided his policies, advised on court intrigues, and shaped the image he showed to the people. She even gave him the heir Octavian never had, a daughter named Claudia Augusta. But the child lived only a few months. Her death left the palace draped in mourning, and it struck Poppaea deeply. Nero, on the other hand, seemed to treat it as an ill omen, one more sign that the gods were turning their faces from him. The loss carved a quiet fissure between them, and like all fissures in Nero's life, it widened. Accounts differ on what happened next, but the most infamous version comes from the historian Suetonius. In the summer of 65 AD, Poppaea was heavily pregnant with a second child. The subject is lost to history, perhaps a political decision, perhaps some petty slight. What we are told is that Nero, already in one of his unpredictable tempers, lashed out. In a sudden rage. It's possible, though less dramatic, that she died from complications of pregnancy, and the story of Nero's kick was embellished by his enemies. But whether or not the blow was real, the fact remains, she was gone, and Nero's hands were forever tied to her death in the minds of the people. Nero was said to have been overcome with grief afterward. In a display both grand and grotesque, he gave Poppaea a lavish state funeral, embalming her body and entombing her in the mausoleum of Augustus, the resting place of Rome's most honored dead. But grief, for Nero, was a performance. Soon after, whispers began that he had taken up with another woman, Statilia Messalina, and even forced her husband to commit suicide to clear the way for marriage. Poppaea's death removed one of the last restraints on Nero's behavior. Without her calculating counsel, he drifted further into excess, paranoia, and cruelty. Rome would soon burn. 64 AD when the first tongues of flame licked at the warehouses near the Circus Maximus. No one knows how it began, an accident, an arsonist, or something far more sinister. But the summer wind carried the fire like a predator through the city's narrow, crowded streets. Rome burned for 6 days and 7 nights. Whole districts vanished into smoke and ash. Stone temples cracked from the heat. Wooden tenements collapsed like kindling. The wails of the displaced filled the air, and the Tiber carried charred debris downstream like a funeral procession. At the time, Nero was away at his villa in Antium. When word reached him, he hurried back, or so some accounts claim. But others, notably the historian Tacitus, say the rumors spread faster than the flames. That Nero had not rushed to save the city, but had stood upon a high balcony, watching Rome burn while singing of the fall of Troy, dressed in theatrical costume. It's an image so perfect, so damning, that it may be more myth than truth. Yet in politics, perception is power, and Rome's perception was that their emperor had either caused the fire or welcomed it. Why would he do such a thing? Some claimed he wanted space to build his grand dream, the Domus Aurea, and his own glittering palace at the heart of it all. But the fire had done more than destroy buildings. It had burned away the last of the people's trust in him. The whispers of madness grew louder. Senators seethed. Armies far from Rome began to wonder whether the emperor was fit to rule. The blaze that consumed the city had also ignited the slow, steady flame of rebellion. In the years after the Great Fire, Nero's Rome was a city rebuilt, but its emperor was a ruler increasingly unmoored from reality. The Senate gritted its teeth through his extravagances. Endless games, costly building projects, and public performances where the emperor demanded standing ovations. The people still cheered, but behind palace walls, patience was wearing thin. In 65 AD, the first serious crack appeared, the Pisonian conspiracy. Named after Gaius Calpurnius Piso, a respected senator, the plot sought to replace Nero with a more stable, more Roman leader. Senators, knights, soldiers, even poets were said to be involved. It failed. Someone betrayed the plan, and Nero unleashed a wave of purges. His former tutor, the philosopher Seneca, was accused of complicity. Nero ordered him to take his own life. In a calm voice, Seneca opened his veins, speaking to friends of virtue as the bathwater turned red. The empire's leading generals were executed or exiled. Artists, thinkers, and allies who had once been his confidants were either gone or living in fear. By removing his critics, Nero also removed the last people willing to tell him the truth. Meanwhile, the provinces were restless. In Judea, a full-scale revolt erupted. In Gaul and Spain, governors whispered of independence. The final blow came from the west. Gaius Julius Vindex, governor of Gaul, raised the banner of revolt, calling Nero a disgrace to Rome. Soon after, the commander of the legions in Spain, Servius Sulpicius Galba, declared himself the rightful emperor. The Senate, sensing the wind's direction, turned on Nero. His once gilded life now reduced to a desperate ride toward a villa on the outskirts of Rome. There, what an artist dies in me, he is said to have murmured, before driving a dagger into his own throat with a servant's help. It was June 9, 68 AD. He was 30 years old. With his death, the Julio-Claudian dynasty, begun by Augustus a century earlier, ended in chaos. The empire would plunge into the year of the four emperors, a bloody contest for the throne. Yet for centuries after, stories of Nero persisted. Some saw him as a monster, others as a misunderstood genius of the stage. And in distant corners of the empire, there were even whispers that he hadn't truly died, that one day the mad emperor would return to reclaim Rome. When Nero's body was laid in the tomb of the Domitii Aenobarbi, few mourned publicly, but Rome itself seemed to sigh in relief. For some, his death meant the end of a nightmare. For others, it was the closing act of a tragic play. In the Senate's official memory, Nero was a tyrant, wasteful, cruel, and dangerously obsessed with art over duty. Historians like Tacitus, Suetonius, and Cassius Dio painted him as a man whose reign began with promise but descended into paranoia and spectacle. Yet in the streets and provinces, his memory was more complicated. He had lowered taxes, staged lavish games for the people, and rebuilt Rome after the fire with better roads, public baths, and a grand new market. To some, he had been a generous ruler, gathering followers who believed Nero had escaped and would soon reclaim his throne. Later, another appeared in Asia Minor, backed by Parthian kings, nearly causing a war. These myths lingered for decades. In Christian writings like the Book of Revelation, the beast, with the number 666 was often interpreted as a coded reference to Nero, suggesting that his spirit, or influence, might return to haunt Rome. In the centuries that followed, his name became a byword for decadence and cruelty. Medieval painters depicted him playing music while Rome burned, a symbol of leadership gone horribly wrong. Yet modern scholars debate whether this image is entirely fair. There are whispers in the historical record that his early rule brought stability and reforms, and that his artistic passions, mocked in Rome, might have been admired in another time. Still, history is not always kind to those who lose power, and so Nero remains one of Rome's most infamous figures. To some, a monster who murdered his own mother and let his city burn. To others, The show must end.